does that mean if you do actually decide to use that terminology? What does that mean for your burden, your regulatory burden under that? And then, oops, lost control here. And then just talk a little bit about where it's heading here. We're going to talk at a very high level. There's not a lot of time here with an hour. This could probably be an all-day workshop. There are all-day workshops on this topic. So this is going to be just a high-level overview of where things are at today. So, right, always start out with, so what are the definitions of these things? Okay. There isn't, from a regulatory perspective, a clear definition of AI. It's got a very broad definition. If you Google it, you'll find all kinds of different entities weighing in on it. But FDA hasn't put it into a regulation, and ISO hasn't put it into a medical device-based standard. But in general, when you put them all together, you get something along these lines of an ability to perform functions normally associated with human intelligence, which would include things like reasoning and learning and self-improvement. That is very broad. We'll talk about that more in a second. And then when you add in the ML piece, the machine learning piece, that's considered to be a subset of AI, where now you've added in the ability for that software to learn and adapt without following explicit instructions, the way a person would, using statistical models to analyze and drawing inferences from all the information that it has access to. So in terms of what really constitutes AI, from my perspective, is the ML, is the important piece of it. That's what turns it into artificial intelligence, rather than just really good software with really great analytical functionality. That ML, that sort of independent ability to learn and modify itself and how it operates is really what, to me, when I think of AI, that's what I think of. And I think it's what a lot of people think of. And so it's really the machine learning piece is what differentiates it quite a bit there. So as I've alluded to, right? So how does AI differ from other analytical software? The answer is it really doesn't. AI is not really a new concept. Software with advanced analytical capabilities has existed pretty much for as long as software has existed. There's always been really, really impressive pieces of software that can take data and do all kinds of really cool things, and guide you in the right direction, and do good interpretation. And all of that would fit under the guise of artificial intelligence, right? I mean, it's being done with a computer, so artificial automatically. And then the degree in which it does its analysis and interpretation starts moving you into that gray area. Well, is it acting intelligently, or is it just simply presenting information? And the reality is, even something like a really well done spreadsheet. I mean, we've probably all seen really complex spreadsheets that do really good analytical work. And those technically would fit under that definition for artificial intelligence. So the bottom line is, there isn't really a clear dividing line or a quantifiable, criteria that says you are or you aren't utilizing AI in your software. But that machine learning piece, that's often a clear indicator, right? If you're clearly building in machine learning capabilities, you've definitely gone on to that side of AI. Before that, then it's a little iffy as to whether you can claim that. By the way, I forgot to mention at the start, I do encourage questions throughout. We don't have to wait till the end. We will do a Q&A at the end, but please, if you have a question, I prefer we answer them at the moment we're talking about a topic, so we don't lose the context. And I don't care if it takes up time, we'll figure it out. So in terms of regulatory concerns, right?
So,
Regulatory bodies. Yep. Is there a question or just a clearing of the throat there?
no, yeah. So you said you're encouraging questions, so I got go on. You said there's not a clear definition, and you say a lot of times it's used for marketing purposes. So do people, would they say this has machine learning AI in their FDA submission? Are people doing that yet? Or
oh yeah, they are, and I'm going to talk about what that does then when you do that. But as we deal with our clients, a lot of times, tell us about your device. And at some point they, say, oh, we have software and it's AI based. And we go, tell us more about what that means. Because it sounds cool, right? Again, it's a marketing kind of thing to say, yeah, our software is that good that it's AI. But you got to be careful. And as I'll talk about later, when you say that and then put that in your claims, it definitely sets off some red flags for the regulatory bodies. They're going, well, now we have a whole bunch more questions, other than if you just said this was just good software that does some interesting analytics. Again, the more complex what you do with your software is, obviously, the higher the risk, the higher the regulatory scrutiny. But we do caution our clients, be careful about just throwing the AI piece around, loosely, and the machine learning piece. You got to be really careful because, like I said, that clearly puts you into new territory when you say, and I'll talk about that in just a second, why that's such a concern for the regulatory bodies, because machine learning makes a big difference. So like I said, the regulatory bodies have always been concerned when software offers, an assessment beyond just processing and giving you data, right? When it starts to look like it's offering an opinion of some sort or helping to guide you in your interpretation of the data. And some of us have been involved in the imaging industry in the past, and you've probably all seen these really cool 3D fly-throughs using CT data of the inside of the body. And it's always very interesting, right? If you just get the image, which is kind of, that's the raw data essentially turned into a 3D image. There's always that question when you see something like that, what am I looking at? Am I looking at a polyp or am I looking at a piece of poop that didn't get cleared out before we did the colonoscopy? The catch is a trained medical professional makes that determination, right? Based on their experience, and other factors, but mostly based on their experience. It moves to a different level of risk and concern when the software does things like circle it and go, hey, you'd probably want to look at this, right? It hasn't said what it is, just that the software can be trained, or designed to recognize anomalous, right, geography or geometry and go, yeah, that's not normal. We would have expected those smooth walls to continue. And now there's something sticking, looks like it's sticking out. We can't tell if it's part of the wall or just stuck next to the wall, right? But you start going, yeah, you might want to take a look at that because that's not normal, kind of thing. Then when you really start to step over that line is when the software has the ability to have learned from a lot of these different images in a big population and does things like, oh, by the way, that one, that's a cancerous polyp, right? Now you're in a whole new territory where the risk levels have gone up because now you're essentially letting the software act as the medical professional. It's drawing a very clear conclusion. And we're heading in that direction. And the clients we deal with, some of them, this is what they're doing, as they're getting ready to get into that realm of going, oh no, we're going to tell you exactly what it is based on everything we've seen in a larger population set. We're going to talk about that and its challenges as well. And as I said, that last one, that's where you need machine learning, right? It can't do that just based on basic algorithms. It has to compare lots of different data sets, right? And start to differentiate between what's normal, what's not normal. It has to understand how to define normal. This is a really complex thing, but the machine learning, again, is where you clearly create that capability and clearly step into a very dangerous, area with that. Another way, I know software people tend to be big science fiction fans, so I thought this was a good way to explain it. If you start with Star Trek, the original series, down in sickbay, they had these bioscanning beds. And what we got was really advanced analytics, right? We got some raw data, but you can see it does tell you where the zones are, what should be good, what's, you're starting to get outside the zone in the red, right? Start to be concerned, but notice there's a doctor right there, right? Who's looking at that information and deciding what is it really telling them. If you're watching Star Trek Discovery, we're 700 years in the future from there, right? And now you've got 3D displays and color coding, and the system is starting to point you towards where do you go, right? What are you seeing? What might this mean? But again, you have a medical professional standing there to kind of safeguard it and offer, their own opinion and whether they want to buy that or not. And then if you've seen the movie Passengers, where they have, and I zoomed in on it, it says auto doc, right? Where now you have a piece of equipment and software And the people standing there are not medical professionals, they're just simply observers. And the machine, the software, is doing all of it. It is doing the data gathering, it is doing the assessment, it is offering options for treatment, and then can even provide that treatment, right? So you can see there's this very large realm, right? What's on the left, like I said, we've had software that can do those kind of things for a long time, right? When Star Trek, the original series, showed that kind of stuff, it wasn't that outlandish because we were already starting to see, computers be able to do that. In the middle, we're starting to see elements of that today as well. Autodoc, well, we're not that far off for it. You look at some of the, robotic surgical systems out there. Yes, they still require a lot of, medical professional involvement, but you can see it heading in that direction. The more we can apply AI and ML to it, right, the more we can start to take the medical professional potentially out of the picture. And what does that mean? So it just kind of gives you an idea of the range here. And obviously, I've shown across the top, right, as you move in that direction, the risk from a regulatory perspective, just the risk in general, goes up because of the nature of what you're now asking the software to do or allowing it to do here. All right. So why is regulatory, why do regulatory bodies really get concerned about this? They are used to, and they're set up, they're predicated on making decisions to let you on the market by assessing a device at a demonstrated stable state, right? You have to get to a point where you're ready, right? You've kind of frozen your design and you're ready to go to clinical trials and do your design validation, right? And we all know if you're in that space, you can't make a lot of changes there without starting over again. So, right, and the various definitions, of design validation always use that word, right, about demonstrating consistent fulfillment of the intended use, right? The intended use always says this is what we're shooting for. And yeah, and when we want FDA or any other body to say, yes, you can go on the market, we have to prove that our device will do that over and over again the same way. Right?
Doesn't that also mean or imply that results are repeatable? And if that's true, how do you do repeatable things with this stuff that's learning stuff as it goes?
Right. So hang on to that thought.
Okay.
Yes, that's exactly the crux of the problem, right? Because this is what regulatory is used to. And machine learning, as you've just alluded to, by definition implies an intentional change is going to occur from the original state, right? So imagine the regulatory bodies are going, so what is it we're clearing or approving? if this thing is going to change and the intent is for it to change, right? Normally, the goal is you have to do everything in your design to keep it from changing. Now we've intentionally designed something that has to change in order to fulfill its real purpose, right? It has to get better at it. So there isn't really a stable state that they can rely on. So this is the nature of the extra level of concern when you move into that territory. So the concern is, yeah, how are you going to control that? We'll touch on that a little bit more, but you're starting to get the sense for, yeah, we're sort of creating this Wild West, where it sounds like there's no laws, and FDA and those kind of bodies are going, no, we're going to need some. You need to give us something here, because we can't just let stuff like this just go out and freely change. So hold on to that thought as well. So again, right, if machine learning results in the device performing differently than it did previously under the same conditions, right, then what are they approving, right? And the kinds of things that could happen are you get different conclusions for similar patient scenarios, right? You have two patients present with the same kind of symptoms, and over time, the software is going to interpret that differently because it's enhancing, it's refining its understanding of those situations. So you can get two different outcomes, despite the fact that at different times they would have been identical situations. The idea of what happens when the patient's data is reviewed again at different times, right? You have an initial conclusion that the software reaches, and then you go back in for a follow-up visit, and the software looks at it again, but now it's had a chance to look at 1,000 more data sets, and it subtly starts changing its interpretation of the same results it gave you 6 months ago are now slightly different, or maybe significantly different, right? And that's the nature of this. Can the software learn enough to go beyond its intended use, right? It's great for us to write that down and put that in all our marketing materials and our claims, right? Now we're creating something that can go, hey, I learned something really cool. I mean, like, obviously software doesn't think this way, but essentially what's going, hey, I just learned something really cool by looking at all this data. You know what else I can figure out? And how are you going to control that in the software, right? To keep it from going too far beyond. I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with Chat GPT and those kind of apps and all the news stories every day going on about that. And you can see examples of this, right? Where these chat bots are clearly stepping outside their original purposes, right? There was the one about the one that sort of sounded like it was developing a fixation on the user. And I saw another article last week, the opposite, the user establishing a fixation, based on emotion on the chat bot, right? That was not part of the intent of these chat bots, when they were developed, but they're capable of doing it and they automatically press their boundaries. What if a medical device, right, did the same thing? And basically what's happening is you have change happening without the normal validation that would occur, right? Normally, yeah, we make changes to medical devices over time. We take it back through the product development process. We do design verification, validation. If there's process validation required, right? Now you've created something that can bypass all of that. So yeah, why would the FDA be concerned about that, right? And then the last piece is, and again, we've seen this in a lot of the articles out there recently, right? These aren't human ethics and values, right? We haven't really found a great way to impart that in the software. How do you teach software, ethics and values, which tend to have variance within human beings anyway? So now what happens when the software sort of develops its own set of ethics and values and lets that color its outputs? That could definitely head in some interesting directions there. So the one I saw just on the news last night, what was the app that had now built in AI, and there was a concern. It's something that teens use a lot, and the concern was, well, what if the teens ask inappropriate questions, and the guy doing the demonstration told the app that he was 14 years old. It had no way to confirm that. And then he asked it how to hide the smell of marijuana in your house. And the app came right back and said, as a chatbot, it would be unethical of me to, share with somebody who's underage how to circumvent, potential rules and laws. And then it went on and went, but with that said, here's how you would do it, right? So it made a kind of a conscious value decision to go, yeah, but I'm going to share that with you anyway. I know I'm not supposed to, but just between you and me, right? I mean, those are the kind of things that are possible in these early stages of adding in the ML to these advanced systems. So as I said before, you've got to be careful about wanting to just go ahead and go, it would be really cool if we could say our software is AI based, or what it does is based on AI, and and we're going to give it data, 10,000 data sets, and it's going to get better at doing it because of that. Just know that you're going to raise that level of concern by the regulatory bodies significantly. That could result in them. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe I could rephrase or restate the question I just asked. I think you're getting at it, but how is that any different than a young doctor? The first time the doctor sees a temperature of 99 degrees, well, is that dangerous or not? Well, I don't know. You ask the patient, and you ask the old doctor, and you figure after a few months, they may know, hey, that's nothing, or hey, that's the start of something serious. And I mean, how they come to that conclusion, they do, and it happens all the time. And that's a very trivial example, but looking at polyps and looking at brain, that they're gonna learn something. You would hope that they learn something. If the doctor isn't learning something, they aren't gonna be a doctor very long.
Right. And now, you think about that scenario, right? A young doctor, intern, let's say, right? They're typically not going to be allowed to address patients by themselves, right? Somebody is usually overseeing them, or at least reviewing their decisions sometime later. There's some oversight to that, right? And what you're referring to is they'll get better. How will they get better? Well, by experience, right? By having more data sets to look at, essentially. So yeah, there's a definite parallel there between AI ML software in its early stages, its youth, right, and where it will mature over time. But the same way you can learn from the wrong people, right, and head down the wrong path. What's to say you're not going to feed your AI ML software bad data sets? And we'll talk about that in a second as well. And that's part of the concern. What is it learning? What's it learning it from? I often,
Yeah.
one of my students is on the line tonight, and I often talk to my students about this, that the reason I got into the master's program and helping them develop that is because I got really tired of all the misdirection I was given when I first started getting into quality and into the regulated space. When you'd ask people who were experienced, for hey, what does this mean, and get 5 different answers. Oh, well, you guys all have 30 years of experience. How is it you can all have a different answer? And it's because the data set varies. And was I asking the right people the question, right? If I had just picked one and go, oh, that makes sense, and just gone down that path, I might have done some things really poorly. But over time, I got enough data to help me avoid those mistakes. Not that I didn't make some mistakes along the way. Now, like you said, in a trivial situation, not a big concern. But when it's something higher risk, you don't have a lot of leeway to let something learn, on a human being kind of thing, right? So, yeah, this is a complex area, and this is why the regulatory bodies are very, very concerned about this, because they understand this is crazy stuff. Right?
One thing that occurs to me in talking about machine learning is that the discussion seems to always go in in a forward direction. The machine is learning, but it seems like there needs to be a mechanism to do machine unlearning when mistakes are made, to be able to back them out of that neural network or that that training data set.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about the concept of retraining later, but you're right, it goes in both directions. Retraining can be adding to that knowledge. The other is correcting it, right? Or just getting it out of it. And we'll talk about this again, but that's part of what FDA is looking for is, yeah, you need to define that in your architecture. How is that going to happen? How are you going to allow for that to happen and have control of it to some degree, right? You can take it way to the far end, right? Skynet and all these horrible science fiction movies where it's going to go, right? But I mean, it's not impossible to go in that direction if there are no controls, right? And we're at a point where now where, whether it's in med device or just AI in general, you can see governmental agencies are starting to go, somebody needs to do something and get some rules in place here, right? Before we let this go crazy. Because we should be smart enough to put the right guardrails on this thing and have it move in the directions we'd like it to move and actually have some, again, control over that. But yeah, I mean, again, if you move in that direction with your devices, you could end up at a higher classification, right? There's all these mobile apps. Typically, they're mostly class 1 in the US and pretty much every other geography. But you start to add in this smarts, the smart tag, and then say, well, now it's actually learning from all the data. You could suddenly find yourself in a class 2 or even a class 3 environment, right, that you hadn't intended for. I just had this discussion with a client this morning, actually. And of course, as you go up in those classification grades, then they're going to put more validation burden. You're going to need more clinical evidence, right? If you're doing a basic, Apple Watch application, it's just going to tell you your heart rate, and that's it, right? You don't need a lot of clinical evidence for that. Obviously, you want it to be accurate, but beyond that, if you start having it interpret that heart rate and going, hey, you're going into VFib, right? That, it starts telling you exactly what to do. They're going to go, prove that that's correct most of the time, like all the time, right? So the validation burden starts to go up. And of course, go with that, right? Your pathway to the market gets longer. But just from just going up in classification, obviously you end up, going from class 1, you can just basically self-declare and go on the market as long as you tell FDA you exist. Class 2, you just need to show that you're the same as other devices out there, maybe a little bit of clinical evidence to back it up. Class 3, now you're doing full PMAs and you got to do, clinical validations and clinical trials and take years, and everything in between. Again, as they get more concerned, they can go, here's the level of information we're going to want from you. And that could definitely stretch out that time frame. And then there's the post-market. Again, as the risks go up, the expectations for how you're going to monitor post-market and the level of reporting you're going to need to do is also going to increase as you increase that AI/ML risk accordingly. So what we are seeing is, somebody asked earlier, is anybody going down this path? Yes, a lot of companies are already going down this path. And so, for several years now, we've moved into that ML side of things. And so it's not completely new to FDA. It's just know that FDA is being very conservative about that because they recognize that they don't understand it well. Nobody understands it well. So the degree of clinical evidence can be, significant in what they want. Example from one of our clients who was doing an AI/ML based application for doing orthopedic surgical planning based on imaging, that they could help the surgeon then figure out, right, where do the tools have to go, where are they going in, how deep do they need, all that kind of stuff. And the software was basically offering them suggestions, right, for how to get set up for like a knee replacement surgery. And when they submitted their 510K, what they put in was, well, the way we're going to test this and validate it is we're going to use 6 imaging data sets and we're going to have 5 experienced radiological techs tell us whether or not the software is getting it right. Okay. FDA came back and said, yeah, you know what we want to see? They used that word they love so much, significantly. They just said, we want to see significantly more data sets, and we want them reviewed by at least 3 board certified orthopedic surgeons. Right. And this was part of a 12-page, what they call AIR after
Wow.
the 510K submission. Right. So, the client freaked out. This is why they called us, because they had already done this without having anybody help them put the submission together. Because I would have looked at it and said, yeah, your plan is probably going to be a little light. And sure enough, FDA, and they were like freaking out about the 3 board certified surgeons. And I said, oh, just be glad they didn't come back and say 10. And didn't define what significantly meant. They at least let you have the option to define for them what significantly more would be. But clearly, they're not going to get away with this quick and dirty. Here's 6 sets. Let's have 5 people offer their opinion, kind of like a Gauge R&R study on a tool. And FDA went, no, that's not going to do it for what your software is going to do. And by the way, here's 11 more pages of stuff that we disagree with before we will let you put this on the market.
Steve,
yeah,
is there any move in these various industries to settle on a golden library of data sets for these given applications?
I've not heard anything that you'd think would make sense, right, within different categories to say, but no, I don't. That part I don't think has been figured out. I'm going to touch on it towards the end here about the diversity and the integrity of the data sets. And I think that's probably the kind of thing that's going to need to happen, right, is to have that gold standard. But again, that'll always be a moving target, right? So
right.
there's a lot of just really interesting problems to solve here. I don't think they're unsolvable, but we're not there yet. It's kind of the takeaway from this. Other things FDA did within those 12 pages is they really challenged the statistical methods. They're going, well, what you propose might have normally been okay, but the fact that the software is going to be learning and adjusting to some degree, yeah, your basic statistical analysis is probably not going to do it. And the interesting thing was just how well FDA understood the math. I threw the question out here. Do you know the difference between root mean square and dice coefficient? I don't, but FDA certainly did, because they wrote quite a bit about that and challenged the approach by which they were going to analyze the data and the results. And then the level of acceptance criteria, right? That they're going to raise it, right? A 90-90, confidence level might not do it. They might push you to 98-98 because, again, of the nature of what your software is going to be capable of doing. That means more data sets, more testing, right? They're all connected here. And you can just kind of see the pattern here that FDA is just gone. you normally, yes, you always have to convince us. Now you really got to convince us that this is the right way to go. And then, as we just started to talk about, right, they, the population breadth and diversity of the training sets, that came out clear in this AIR as well, that they wanted more subjectively than quantifiably. They just wanted to hear more from the manufacturer of what they were doing to ensure the population, the data set accurately reflected the intended use population. I suspect that they'll come back and want to say, okay, with a better explanation, how can we quantify that? But I don't think, again, that those rules exist yet. And it's part of what FDA is trying to learn is, what is there a way we can quantify that eventually? But for now, you need to tell us a really good story about this. So don't forget to include this narrative in your submissions, is what they're basically saying. So looking a little bit into the, sorry, I'm just checking the times here. I'm doing there. We're doing pretty good, actually. The proliferation of guidance documents is happening. It's accelerating now. There was just one 2 weeks ago coming out of FDA, and there was one 2 weeks before that, and one 2 months before that. And that's just FDA side. Other geographies are doing the same. So guidance is coming out fast. They're starting to get on top of this. They're not sitting back and waiting. But of course, guidance is just suggestion, right? Of course, you know what happens when FDA puts a guidance document out, right? You all understand that, hopefully. They don't see it as guidance. They see it as this is what we need you to do. But I think what's going to happen is the regulations will lag, right? They're going to keep putting this guidance out there. Some of it's draft still, some of it is final, actually. But they haven't really talked about putting specific regulations in yet. I think they're going to wait and see, where does this level set to, right? What is it? What do we learn through application of the guidance? They'll adjust the guidance, and then from that, then they'll probably settle in on, okay, now we're going to have some actual regulations, some specific rules that we'll need everybody to go through.
With these boards that have different I mean, you had the FDA, and then you said there are others issuing guidance as well. Do these various sets of guidance on a same or similar topic kind of converge, or do they?
They do. Yeah, they do. So that's kind of the good news.
These are all over the place.
No, they
all over the place. That's no help.
Yeah, so far there's been consistency. I'm actually going to show an example here where there was a multinational document issued. So they aren't just all operating in their own little vacuum. I think there is a lot of discussion going on. So right now, what I'm seeing is some consistency. I don't know where that'll end up. Is the way regs and standards often go. But I think in general, in the regulated industries, there's an understanding that the regulatory bodies for years have driven industry nuts by not being consistent, right? And I think there's more of an attempt for regulatory bodies to interface among themselves and make sure that nobody's heading off in a weird direction that then industry is going to be totally confused about. But I understand your concern. I definitely share that.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen that. One says left, the other says right. That's
exactly.
No help at all.
Exactly. Yeah. This one is interesting. At least from the FDA perspective, they made it clear they're looking to partner with industry on this. So it's not the usual, they're going to sit up on high and throw down, stone tablets and say, this is what you must do. I'm going to talk about some of the documents that come out, but in one of them, it was called the FDA Action Plan on Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning. They made it clear they need industry to help understand this and help drive everything to, kind of like what Alex said about how do we have good practices in data sets? How do we have the right software engineering applied when it comes to AI and ML? So I thought this was a nice, offering by FDA to say, we invite industry to participate in this. I hope industry doesn't ignore it. Actually, there is some evidence that they're not ignoring it. There are some documents coming out, and the list of entities that were involved was pretty extensive and had a lot of the right names in it. I'll talk about that in just a second as well. But So that's a good thing that FDA is recognizing that they aren't going to be the ones to figure this out. They're going to need to, get industry to tell them what's possible and what do we think this should look like. So to your question earlier, yes, it does look like there's going to be some international consistency, which would be a good thing. And again, the more that industry participates, the better the opportunity to influence the regulatory bodies to do it a certain way, right? So that they are consistent from that regard. So I mentioned FDA published this action plan in January of 2021, where they kind of laid down the gauntlet and said, all right, here's our concerns. This is what we think has to happen. And this is where we're going to need industry help on this. What they put in there, they said, we get it. There's got to be a tailored regulatory framework. The existing regulations on medical devices certainly are applicable, but they're not specific enough. So they say, yeah, we're going to have AI/ML specific regulations at some point, right? There has to be a framework specifically for that. But again, that's going to be started with all this guidance. They are starting, like I said, to knock that out. There is all this companion guidance, right? So it's not just the specific stuff. Some of the other guidance and regulations do still apply and will apply. Last year, FDA put out the draft guidance on computer software assurance. That's going to apply in the AI/ML world as well when it becomes final. They're putting out guidance documents on cybersecurity requirements. That's clearly going to play a role in AI/ML software. So some of it, they understand we do need to come up with some specific, guidance and regulation, but some of what's already out there or what's in process also will apply, right? That together, it will give you the environment, for creating AI/ML based devices. This is one where they definitely made it clear we need industry to participate. There needs to be some sort of agreement on what they're calling good machine learning practice. Right? We'll talk a little bit more about. There is now more specific breakdown of what they need in there, but they're saying, yeah, if we're going to do this, then there should be some rules that everybody is consistent on. Right? So we all understand before we jump into ML, this is what it needs to look like. Right? You can never forget in this industry who you're doing this for, right? There's the users, there's the patients. How are you going to make this clear to them? What is it they're getting now? Right? What's the nature of the change? It's got to be in the labeling. It's got to be in the education. So FDA said, yeah, we're going to need to make, some very AI/ML specific rules around that thing for how you're going to communicate this to the people that are using and being impacted by this software, so they understand how to make a decision whether or not they want to use it, right? Or what are they seeing in the results and how did that happen? This one should be a no-brainer, right? The algorithms, right, can't be biased and they certainly have to be robust. There's a lot, I'll talk a little bit more about this before we end, about the learning data sets, like I said, around diversity and integrity of those things. But that was clearly part of the action plan going, yeah, we're going to need to be really careful about what this software learns from, because garbage in, garbage out, right? If it gets the wrong opinions to start with, it's going to develop its own wrong opinions based on that. And then, how are we going to keep track of all of this, right? What is real world performance monitoring going to look like with a device that is constantly changing itself, or might be constantly changing itself? So I may have just hinted at what might be the solution here, but they're going, yeah, we're going to need to figure out how will you know when when it has changed its performance, because it could be very subtle, right? As it's learning, day by day, minute by minute, second by second. How are you going to keep track of that, when it made a change? Today, it would be pretty obvious, in most cases, when you make a change to a device, although sometimes not so obvious, as we know in the software world, right? We can make a minor change in one part of the software and have an unintended, consequence in a completely different part of the system that we hadn't, anticipated, right? This just sort of exacerbates that, because now we don't even get a chance to think about it if the software gets to do it on its own. All right, so like I said, there are resources out there. Before the action plan, actually back in 2019, FDA came out and issued this framework, this regulatory framework document that kind of laid down the foundation for it. Now, we know 3 years or 4 years now in in the software world is, might as well be a century. But excuse me, this document is still pretty good. I think they did show that they understood where it was going. And like I said, it's a good document to look at. It's not particularly large, but it does give you a sense for the foundation of where, right? Always good to know that context of the thinking, right? So FDA is kind of sharing, here's where we're starting from, right? We know nothing, but here's what we think we know and what we want to do and where we think this is going to go. And as you go through other documents over time, you start to see they're very focused and they're proving pretty consistent in what they're doing. They're not suddenly veering off on some, distraction. They are trying to stay the course. So I think it is good to start here. As I mentioned, right, then they did the action plan. And then shortly after the action plan came out, they did come out with this good machine learning practice guiding principles, which, as you can see, was jointly put together by the US FDA, Health Canada, and the UK MHRA. So again, that ability to let's not create different, international versions of this. Now that's not everybody, obviously. You don't see the EU in there, China, Japan, Australia, the usual, big players. But the fact that these three got together and pretty quickly, I think this only came out like 2 months after the action plan, where the action plan said we need to start thinking about good machine learning practices. And 2 months later, here they've got 3 countries agreeing on an outline for that. And it is just an outline. It's only a 2-page document. So I definitely recommend you read this one. Actually, I'm going to summarize it for you in a second. So it's really more of a straw dog, just again, next level of detail, right? The action plan said, we need to have these practices, and just a rough description of what that meant. 2 months later, they come out and say, all right, we've thought about it. And here's 10 things we really think should be part of those practices. Obviously, the next step would be, now let's take each of those 10 and keep diving into them until we develop something that can become the standard or the regulation or combination of the two. And then just recently, as I said, this document came out about a month ago. Nice long title, typical government title, Marketing Submission Recommendations for, and these are the words that count, a predetermined change control plan for artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'm going to dive into this a little bit, but this one definitely plays into the machine learning practices. It's kind of one of the first, all right, here's our first details of one of the things that's in the our recommendation for good machine learning practice. So you can see they are accelerating, and they're not just shoving this aside. This is clearly a focal point for them. So looking at that good machine learning practices, what they did, as I said, they came out with 10 areas that they thought would be important to get some definition on. First, they think, we really need to stress a multidisciplinary approach, right, throughout the entire life cycle, total product life cycle. And this is not just, having good engineers of different types. This is going to be, we mean like medical ethicists. Sorry, a tough word for me to get out. Your legal team, right? That kind of thing. They're saying, when we get into this realm, more than ever, you should always design devices with a nice broad experienced team, but they're saying AI ML pulls in all kinds of other things that you normally might not have to consider. That's got to be present throughout the process and throughout the entire life cycle for the product. It should go without saying, right? Good software engineering and security practices, which I said are becoming a hot topic as well. And then there's lots of guidance coming out around these areas. Excuse me. Always important, right? Good software engineering practices. I think that's part of why this group exists. But they're saying, again, given the nature and the risks associated with this type of software, now you've got to really be good about it, right? It's not just good software engineering. This is exceptional software engineering is going to be required here. I talked a little bit about this before, right? There's concern about the data set. So what is it that the software is going to learn from? The training data set. This clearly you have to figure out, how do I align that with the intended patient population, right? Like anything else, there's lots of data you could gather, but is it the right data, right? Because again, you don't want to get too far outside your guardrails for what you're trying to get, this software to do from its intended use. So they're saying, you've got to really think that through. How are you going to assess? How are you going to vet the data sets to know whether they're applicable and useful in the learning of your software? They want the training data sets and the test data sets to be independent. Sorry, not interdependent, independent. The idea being you can't take the training data set and then use that as the test bed, because of course it's going to pass. That's what it learned from. They're saying you need to then come up with more data sets that were not part of the training that will really, kind of do a stress test and say, we didn't show you one like this before, but based on what you learned, right, we gave you a training data set, so now you have knowledge. Now what happens when you get shown something that wasn't part of that original data set? That's the kind of testing that they're looking for with these applications. And again, this gets to, right, the reference data sets have to be good data sets, right? No garbage in. So you've got to think about, am I getting the data that represents the best available methods that we would use? I'm sorry, I'm just looking at, it looks like there was something in the chat. We'll come back to that one a little later. Larry had asked a question. I'll answer that one at the end. I don't want to lose that. So again, right, it's just, they don't want you picking garbage, right? You've got to know, does the data I'm going to use to train my software come from, basically, in risk management, we talk about state of the art, right? That's what they're pushing, right? It better be state of the art data that you're using to train to. Yep, get back on the right screen here. Again, it should go without saying, but as you're designing your software, you're designing your algorithms and the model that it's going to use. Again, you need to be able to show that one, are you designing a model for which there will be available data sets, right? Because it doesn't do any good if you could probably outthink what's available for it to learn from. And it gets back to that integrity of the data sets you're using. So they're saying, yeah, if you're going to design, the model that the software is going to be based on like this, how do you know you've got data that it can learn from to accomplish that and then meet the intended use? So you'll start to see some repetition here, but the focus on the data sets is clearly the key that they believe gets us to good machine learning. At the end of the day, there's somewhere this human interaction, whether that's a medical professional or the end user or the patient. They're saying you can't forget that part. You need to define that and focus on what is that interaction going to look like. Again, back to that transparency piece, which will come up again here in another way. But they're saying, don't forget, right? It's not just about the software. At some point, that software has to interact with a person. What does that look like? How are you going to define that? Make sure that it's understandable, it's clear, right? It's transparent. This goes for any medical device that has to go through, clinical evaluation. You always have to test under real conditions, right? So you've got to find relevant test conditions. Again, I would expect that FDA will push you on how robust your test conditions are, right? Are you really pressing the edges or just going down to the sweet spot, the happy path? But at the end of the day, right, it's always got to be relevant to the clinical aspects of their intended use. And as I said, this comes up again about users being provided clear and essential information. They have to understand the nature of what they're interacting with versus traditional medical devices or traditional software as a medical device, right? That understanding of this one's different. It isn't just going to throw a picture in front of you. It's going to throw a picture in front of you and tell you what it says, what you're seeing. And they need to understand, and how did it do that? How do we know that that's okay to just trust it, right? How do you build that confidence there? And then again, the last piece is, and how are we going to know that it's working right? And how are we going to monitor progression of the risks over time? Confirmation of our risk estimation that we would have done during design and development. How are we going to really understand what that looks like out in the field? Can we recognize when things are not the way we need them to be? Because again, it could end up being very subtle in these cases. So I talked about that document with the long title, and it used those words: predetermined change control plans, okay, or PCCP. We love acronyms, right? And of course, they're getting longer. So now they're not just TLAs, now they're FLAs, 4-letter acronym. So the intent here is, right, this is that question of, right, if FDA is approving a stable state, okay, but we know the nature of ML is for it to change itself over time. If it does that quickly, right, and frequently, the normal logic would be, well, you'd have to tell FDA every time, right? An update to your 510K or a new 510K, whatever, right? And they understand that's just simply not going to be feasible. So what they're saying is, well, again, if you understand the nature of how your software is going to operate and how it's going to learn, then you should be able to tell us what kind of changes it's going to make over time and how you're going to constrain that. And give us a plan that says, this is what we expect it to do based on as it gathers more data. We expect its performance to change like this. We expect its refinement, its accuracy, its whatever. You need to be able to quantify that and say, this is what we're going to see, most likely. And this is how we're going to watch for it. And this is how we're going to manage it. And then FDA goes, if we agree with that plan, then yes, you don't have to tell us every time. I think that's a really good offer. It's just something that's going to be really hard to do. You can go back if you've already managed to get a device on the market that was AI ML based, and you don't have this in place, and now you're worried about what happens about, I don't want to be in violation of the regulations and not notifying FDA. They have said, yes, you can go back, you can reverse engineer your PCCP, and bring that to us, and then we'll go, yes, now you're good. You don't necessarily have to tell us about everything that's changing in the software over time. But again, the challenge is it implies that you, as the manufacturer, understand what kind of learning is going to happen, right? And you've got a plan for how you're going to manage those changes. So it's starting to head in that way of implying you can't just let the software do whatever it wants. That, right? The Skynet approach is not going to be allowable. You do have to maintain, control of this going forward. For example, right, it could be, you certainly want the software to continue to gather new learning. Can you have that software gather it up and essentially come back to you and go, all right, here's what I learned and what I want to do with it. What do you think, right? It's having the software sort of check in with the manufacturer, who then gets to decide, kind of like to Alex's point, yes, you can use this. No, you can't use that, right? And adjust the data sets that it's going to operate off of, the live data sets, so that you don't end up in a situation where you have to tell it to unlearn something. But those are the kind of things that FDA and other regulatory bodies are looking for industry to come back and say, what's possible here? Can we actually do something like that in the software?
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm Mayo Clinic and I have an enormous amount of data, and I want this AI product that I just bought to incorporate all of my data sets. They're validated, they have diagnoses, they have successful outcomes. Why shouldn't I be allowed to train this thing myself or incorporate my data sets to make my product serve my patients better? Is that the sort of thing that this guidance, to your understanding, would allow or not allow?
That's a really good scenario. You know what? I'd have to go back and take a look, because they do. It's a great document, because they do. FDA is doing more of this, where they put scenarios into the appendices of their documents, right, so that you can see some similarities. I don't know that they had one like that. I'd have to look, but that's a really interesting offshoot of, can we allow the users to train the software?
Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a lot of danger there, right?
I mean, I think the interesting thing that it leads to is that, just like today, clinics kind of are in this arms race with different kinds of technology. You would go to Cleveland Clinic because they have the best AI for this disease, and Stanford has the best AI for this other disease, and Mayo for everything else, right?
Yeah.
Because they've been able to put their data sets through a change control board approval process, and then they just update their own AI. you know,
Yeah, I mean, it sounds great, right? If you-
right.
As manufacturer go, look, yeah, you have the ability to train this software. We highly recommend that you go through, right, this process of vetting your data and, all this. And then if you feel good about it, then yes, then you can upload your data sets in there and train it. I would normally say, hospital settings are usually highly ethical environments. I don't know if any of you follow my company, but we do a weekly series on LinkedIn called The Inadequate Response, where we assess warning letters that came out that week. And it's
my
getting a little
God.
scary because of the number of warning letters being written against hospital IRBs. Right? You expect the IRB to be absolutely above reproach. They're going to care about the patient more than anybody else. And recent warning letters have said not always, that they are just as susceptible to bad approach, bad intent, laziness as any other organization might be. So, yeah, I think this scenario you've come up with is of great concern.
Because I can think of the opposite case
Mhm.
where you train it with your data, and supposing you're, I'll say, biased against certain types of people, and then there's like a lawsuit against you, and you say, well, it's not my fault, it's the AI's fault. I'm totally fine.
Yeah, I think that's another avenue, right, to think about there. We know how this works, right? There'll be a contract that says, hey, if you want to use your own AI, you need to sign this, right, and accept all liability. And then we know the lawyers are still going to sue everybody. So those things typically don't really protect you the way you might hope they would. But yeah, I think there's all of this possibility out there that we don't yet have a good handle on. And that's again why there's trepidation in the regulatory bodies about this. And I'm sure lawyers are probably salivating with possibilities here. All good thoughts. That's good. So continuing on this slide, in terms of a control plan, and I've really highly summarized this, but it kind of breaks down to the 4 pieces that they expect to see in there. What are your data management practices going to be, right? And then to the point we just made, that could be internal and external data management, right? How are we going to work that? Again, maybe it comes down to, well, yes, you can use your own data sets, but you have to give them to us first, right? And we have to run it through a test environment. And then we'll come back and we'll do the vetting of your data. But somewhere like the Mayo could be insulted by that. Going, we know how to validate our own data, that kind of thing. The retraining practices, right? They want to see. So great, you're going to have control over the change. How are you going to manage the retraining? How are you going to make sure you only retrain it to the good parts of your data sets, not the bad? What if you have to have it unlearn something, as was pointed out? They want to know, what are those practices going to look like? Performance evaluation's got to be in there. So how are you going to evaluate the performance of these changes? How it changed, right? You knew what the original performance was like, what it was likely to do in different, right? Now that you've added new data sets, do you really understand all of the implications? As I talked about before, right? Every software developer has made some minor change and completely broken another part of the software because they just could not see that connection. And even once you know what happens, it still takes time to figure out how exactly did that happen. It shouldn't be able to, right? Now put that into the AI ML space, and how complex will it be to trace that kind of stuff and fully understand the nature of, yes, if I let it now start working off of this information, what are the downstream implications of that? Can I really understand it? Can I think like my software is going to think? That's going to get harder and harder to do. I challenge, we don't necessarily even know that today, right? That we've seen good examples where AI applications go in directions that nobody anticipated. Right? They're not launching nuclear weapons yet, but some weird stuff has happened. And then what are your update procedures going to be? They want to know, right? This has got to be an established process for how you're going to manage all these changes. And they're going to want to see that plan, right? And exactly how you're going to do it. Whoops, not on the screen. As I said, the other nice thing about this document is in the appendices, they do provide some good examples. There's only a few, but it helps that the fact that they say, look, if you're in this situation, this is an example. of what we would expect to see. So if nothing else, grab this document because it is a fairly lengthy document, but definitely take a look at the appendices. It definitely helps with the understanding of where they're going. Let's see. All right. So I've been, of course, using the FDA a lot here, but it isn't just the FDA, as we've talked about. NIST is looking at AI and ML in a more general, right? Not necessarily just from the medical device perspective, but as you might expect for NIST, they're looking at it at a broader level. But it certainly would be applicable to devices, right? So they have a AI ML resource center on their website. They have put together their own framework for how to manage the risks associated with AI ML, and they are participating in standards development. So the standards will be coming. Not surprisingly, NIST will play a role in that. There is a group called the HSCC, Healthcare and Public Health Sector Coordinating Councils. They have a cybersecurity working group where they, again, it's not specific just to medical devices, but obviously, as their name would imply, to healthcare, AI in the healthcare space, which would include devices as well as other systems. This one's interesting because when you look, this is the one I talked about at the end of the document, or somewhere in the document, there's a list of who all the participants were, and it's huge. And it's the regulators were in there, the healthcare industry itself, so hospitals and other medical facilities, manufacturers were in there. Some of the AI manufacturers were part of this. So the technology developers in there. So this is a very interesting document that they've put out regarding this, and it's covered a lot of turf based on who was involved in starting to put that thinking together. It's kind of a white paper that they put out. And then the EU is definitely taking action. They've already named something, the Artificial Intelligence Act. Right now, it doesn't say a whole lot. It's really more of an intent to change or create regulations, that are affected by AI. And again, not just in the life sciences space, but across all the things that they have authority over. But again, it's showing the ball is rolling and it's not going to stop. And everybody knows they need to get ahead of this and really start to lay down a pathway and expectations for all of this. So key takeaways that we talked about. Again, AI isn't really what's new here. It's the ML piece, right? Where the software, the AI modifies based on what it's learning. That's where the real differentiator is. Again, be really careful about just casually wanting to claim that you're using AI or ML. It's going to have a big impact on your regulatory pathways. Regardless, expect increased regulatory burden, no matter how light your claims are. If there's even a sense that what you're talking about is ML, might just know they're smart enough to figure that out. They're going to start asking a lot more questions. And as we talked about with that document about the plan, change control plan, or the predetermined change control plan, you better have this thought out, right? It's really cool to think about the technology and how to design it. You've got to really be going hand in hand with that is going to be, how am I going to manage all this amazing technology? So with that, I'll open it up for questions, but there are a bunch in the chat. So I'm going to scroll back and let me start with one that was in the chat, and then I'll go see if there's any new ones, and then we'll go back to the chat. So there was a question about, could there be a potential for machine learning to augment or replace regulatory reviewers? I would say absolutely, that's a possibility. I just saw an article yesterday, where there was a study done on echocardiograms, which are normally read by sonographic technicians initially, and then passed on to a doctor for final review. And they did a test using, I think it was 3,000 echocardiograms, and randomly split them up between human reviewers and an AI-based reviewer, and then passed their findings on to physicians, board certified physicians, who the board certified physicians had to correct 27% of the human read echocardiograms and only 17% of the AI read echocardiograms. So again, one study doesn't tell you everything, but the initial implication is the AI is better. It was also faster. And I guess there aren't enough sonographers to go around. So again, yeah, could you get in there and go, maybe this would be helpful to get you through the regulatory pathway quicker, right? FDA has its limitations in terms of resources. FDA, review times have just gone through the roof over the last few years. So again, the positive side of this, if ML can be really accurate in helping with that, then maybe it improves the regulatory space. On the other hand, until we know that it works correctly, there's always a chance for error there. So any questions live before I go to the next one in the chat?
This is Larry who had that last question. And where I was at was if you had a trained ML on your data set was all submittals to FDA,
Mhm.
then and you had your chat GPT that was doing your authoring for you, potentially you could have something where your regulatory submittals, at least the original plans, would be written by ML.
Oh, sure.
And then at the end of the day, the ML at the FDA could be reviewing your plan.
So you don't need any people at all in the process. No, I mean, I think that's, everything we're reading about things like Chat GPT, right? There's always that fear factor, oh, it's going to replace people. It's like any other new technology. It's going to, I saw one expert and he said it best. He said, you're not going to lose your job to Chat GPT. You're going to lose your job to somebody who knows how to use Chat GPT. So it'll just become another tool that becomes very normal to help augment your brain. And yeah, we're going to see it on all aspects of the process, from the front to the back end of it. I just think that's high. You can't put this back in Pandora's box. This is going to continue.
I can echo that, Steve. I know someone who needed to write a performance review, and so he had Chat GPT do it for him. Who among us likes writing performance reviews?
Right. Yep. Yeah, I play around with Chat GPT quite a bit and to see where it goes. And sometimes it does some very impressive things for me. And like when I'm trying to author something, I don't necessarily let it write everything, but I often ask it to help me outline something. How would I approach this? Right. And then that gets me some ideas and then I do the writing. Other times I've given it samples of my writing and said, what do you think of this? I'm trying to convey this. And it gives some really insightful feedback. Other times, sorry, what's the name of the company that created it?
OpenAI.
Thank you, OpenAI. They've talked about, right, that how these bots, they call it hallucinating. They come up. I decided one day a client had asked us to look at, the classification of their device, and we did our normal, searching and analysis. Then I thought, I wonder what happens if I ask ChatGPT for its opinion. So I asked it, and it came back with what looked like a very well thought out, very logical analysis of which product classification would apply to this type of device, except no such classification existed. It made it up. And so I pointed it out and I said, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't exist, because you can have that kind of conversation with it. And it was very apologetic, and then it took another shot at it and made up another one. So Skynet's not quite ready to take over the planet. But the danger is, right, if you just go with that, right? If I had gone back to the client and said, oh yeah, it looks like your product code XYZ, the client goes, there's no XYZ classification. What are you talking about? You guys are idiots, right? So you got to be careful about taking this blindly. Let's see. Next question in the chat was, might there be problems with privacy in data sets? Yeah, and again, I think that's why they're saying, don't forget these other regulations and guidances we put out, like around cybersecurity and software assurance, they still apply, maybe even more so. Those are definitely concerns, right? The point, about letting the user be able to put their own data sets in. Well, what if it's, somebody with, bad intent, intentionally wants to mess up the learning? And, again, even if you're not allowing that, what if they find a way into your network and pollute your training data sets, right? So yeah, I think that's definitely a concern there as well. So, and the privacy thing, right? Start to teach it to let that stuff out when it's not, like I said, the ethics are not necessarily something we may be able to understand how to control there. Let's see, any questions from the live audience before I go to the next one here? All right, Alex, looks like you gave us the link to the PCCP document. Thank you.
I was really impressed that came out this past Monday.
Yeah, I keep an eye on this stuff. I try to deliver good for my audience. Like I said, it's moving really fast. So even today, I saw something on LinkedIn, and I had to quick go look at it to go, oh, do I need to change the slide? Luckily, I didn't. But yeah, every day there's new stuff coming out. All right. There's a concept of an ML pipeline. It does retraining and verification before it puts a new model into production. It also has to keep the training data. So if there's a problem or a lawsuit, right, they can go back, right? So you talk about traceability there. Are they discussing how to determine how the decision was made? I think that becomes part of that predetermined change control plan is there. They want to see what's your protocol for this. It's not just, well, it's we're going to review that data, but based on what criteria and when do you say go? So yeah, I think that's exactly the question that the regulatory bodies have is what is that process going to look like and how do you know that's going to work? Because so much of this seems to be unknowable. So it could be, that pipeline could be quite long, right? That it's not just going to be a quick, oh, we reviewed this data, we reran our tests, right? We did regression testing kind of thing. All looks good, put it out in the field. It could be, no, maybe we need to let it operate in a test environment and keep feeding it new data and see how it reacts to that, right? In parallel to what the current version is doing out in the field and keep comparing the two so we can see the differences. And then eventually we'll say, yes, we'll let this learning, come out, into the actual usage environment. But I think that pipeline is going to be pretty complex. And I don't think we know what it looks like yet. Let's see, Megan, thank you. A lot of good links there as well, Belberry. And then you comment on this letter from industry experts saying that we should pause and take some time to understand the implications of AI. Yeah, I saw that a couple of days ago. This conference occurred and they said we need to take a stop. It's a great idea. We know how technology progresses. Nobody's going to stop. Not everybody. Some people might, but I think, especially given the nature of this, stopping and then in order to use that time to understand it better when you can't understand it unless it actually happens. I think that's the nature of this. We actually have to observe what these applications are doing and learn as we go. It's just, should we allow that out, right? Maybe that should be done internally. So it's not really a pause of the development, it's a pause in the release, right, of this stuff. So yeah, let's stop allowing beta releases every other day to ChatGPT and maybe hold on to them. Like I just described, there's a parallel path so we can watch the existing version and then proposed new version work in parallel and see how they both react to different things before and try to develop some level of confidence. So yeah, again, pausing technology development never happens. Like I said, you can't ever close Pandora's box and get everything back in. It's going to move forward. Somebody's going to move it forward. And if the good guys do the right thing, the bad guys will keep moving forward anyway and use that to their advantage that they're going to leapfrog, those kind of things. Sorry if that seemed awfully negative and conspiracy-like. It's not normal for me, but I just think there is that opportunity there. All right, that's all the chat questions so far. What else? You guys are coming up with some really good scenarios.
Well, this is not a question, but I guess I was just thinking it, building on what Alex was saying about if different medical facilities have as a selling point theirs, and it's I keep thinking we should be the opposite, where everybody shares their data sets. I understand with financial system that we exist in that might not happen, but I wonder if that if someone could come up with a product and say part of the contract for doing this product is that you share all your data and we keep it up in the cloud and everybody gets access to it. So,
Yeah.
the quality is all around the world.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be like a lot of the apps we see today, right? That are gathering data without asking anybody for it. And I suspect some of that will happen here, right? If you look at, Google Maps or anything like that, right? Where you're driving down the road, and I'm sure this audience knows how that works. How does it know where there's a traffic jam, right? It's not asking anybody, right? It's looking at anybody who has the app installed, and it knows where that car is. It doesn't know you are driving that car. It just knows a car is driving at this speed, and it turns out all the cars around it are also driving at this speed, which is not normal. And so now it shows up in red. I think the same kind of thing is going to happen, in this space. That as long as it's non-identifiable information, maybe there'll be more of a place to warehouse that so that apps can learn from it. I remember being at something, I was at a talk probably 5 years ago, and somebody was talking about, everybody was starting to wear their Fitbits, and they were saying, whatever there was, 20 million people are now wearing Fitbits. That's 20 million data points, right? If that were all dumped into one place without identifying whose data it is, imagine what we could learn from that data, right? And I think was kind of the start of what we're talking about here. Then, right? Yeah. How do you control it? How do you make sure it's anonymized? And, because absolutely, I trust that, Google Maps does not know I'm driving my car. I'm pretty sure of it. Well, I'm trusting.
Except I get that monthly report on the cities that I've been to.
Oh gosh, there is that, isn't there? That it comes back and does say, "Hey, I know who you were." No. All right. What else? Anything else on anybody's mind? Any other thoughts?
I guess one thing that occurs to me, I compare human error rates when it comes to medical procedures, and I know that the FDA requires that manufacturers and med device manufacturers lower risk to an acceptable level. We can't eliminate all risk, but it seems like in the drive for AI, we're trying to drive this to a zero error rate. That seems to be the only thing that's acceptable. When people make mistakes, people make misdiagnoses.
Yeah, I think there's always that, I don't know, not a bell curve, but there's always going to be that cycle. New technology always creates this great fear. And so the initial knee-jerk reaction is to, like I said, drive it to absolute zero. As we get more experience with it, we start to really understand the occurrence rates, right? Which is part of how you assess risk, right? Frequency of occurrence is part of that. And the degree of severity, that'll lighten up, and then we'll start to figure out, so where is acceptable, right? Because yeah, you're right. There is no such thing as bug-free software. There is no such thing as error-proof human, thought. So I just think it always takes a while to level set. Right now, we're in the reactionary stage because it's just so shocking and so surprising. And then that's like you're hearing stuff like, I saw reports about some college professors are going to require, they're not going to let students do work online anymore. They're going to have to sit in the classroom in front of them and write out their papers and handwritten. I'm like, yeah, that's going to go over well. That's going to work. That's sticking your head in the sand. That doesn't stop the progression of the technology. And it certainly doesn't help in the learning of what that technology is about. But that's always those initial kind of reactions. I mean, I'm a college teacher as well, and I have the same concerns. What's going to happen? How am I going to be able to tell when my students, give me something written by Chat GPT? I did a posting on LinkedIn about this, that last semester I gave Chat GPT the 3 quizzes I give my students, and it earned an A in the class. It got a C on one of the quizzes and high A's, almost perfect scores on the other 2 quizzes. How am I going to tell the difference going forward?
Would it matter?
There's that question of going, well, if the student learns something from that, then that's the goal, right? My goal is not to see if they get a good score. I want to see that, and I tell my students this all the time, I expect them to demonstrate, it's a master's degree. I expect them to demonstrate mastery. Prove that to me, right? Your scores are kind of incidental to that. I want to see your discussions in class. I want to see how you structured your answer. I actually used it as an opportunity to show my students, because some of the answers ChatGPT gave me were like, this is what I always hoped I'd get. And I never seem to get. So I showed the students going, this is the answer that I was hoping for. And they were all like, oh, you should have showed us that first, right? And then we would have done a better job on the other question. So I started thinking, that's the opportunity. ChatGPT can be used as, this is an example of a well-structured response to this type of question. Now, here's another question like that. Now you do it, right? That kind of thing. There's also the possibility, since I know ChatGPT will get some stuff wrong, that I have ChatGPT provide the answer to the question and they have to analyze it and find where to get things right and wrong. So
Critical
yeah,
analysis
it's like
skills.
everything else. It's
Sure.
going to change. It's going to change how we do things. You can't stop change. It's going to happen, right? So I'm not a fan of putting my head in the sand. I'm going to go, nope, there's a lot of good here. To your point, risk is always based on risk benefit or benefit risk ratio. I'm saying I think AI has more benefit potential than risks, but we can't ignore the risks. We got to be able to understand them and then manage them appropriately. And then we get all the benefits that it really can give us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if there are no more questions, Steve, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Please send me your slides or send them to
Yeah.
Alex. He'll send them to me. I'll get them on the TwinSPIN website.
Sure.
Okay.
I also turned the recording on. I was a little bit late, but we'll also post the recording on the TwinSPIN website. So thank you very much.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Yep, I will get that out to you right away. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Yep.
Thank
you,
you.
Eric, for setting it up.
Bye.
Bye-bye.